All right. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining. We'll go ahead and get started. My name is Sunny, and I'm one of the PhD students here in the Religious Studies Department at Stanford University. Whether it's your first time or you've participated before, we want to welcome everyone to the third of 5 Ptarmigan events taking place this academic year. The Ptarmigan series showcases a slate of distinguished scholars who discuss various themes related to late ancient studies. And for this event, we've budgeted exactly 1 hour that includes the lecture, followed by a brief Q&A session. We ask that during the presentation, you kindly take advantage of the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. My colleague who oversees the series, Anuj, will come in after the lecture to present those questions to our speaker. For today's program, we are very privileged to have with us Dr. Dina Boero, Associate Professor of Ancient Mediterranean History at the College of New Jersey. Dr. Boero has made several contributions to the field of late antiquity, and her current book project is titled The Anatomy of a Cult, Simeon the Stylite and His Devotees in Late Antiquity. Today, she'll be speaking to us on Stylite columns of the Limestone Massif. And with that, I'll pass the virtual microphone on to you. Thank you so much for your time this evening.
All right, thank you so much for having me, and thank you to Michael Penn and the students who organized this series. This has been a really wonderful contribution to the field of late antiquity and Syriac studies, and I feel really honored to be here today. So traditionally, this series has been based around often a single text or author or object and so today I'm going to do just that. I'm going to focus on Stylite columns. And there's going to be a lot of pictures in this PowerPoint and a lot of this is a material culture presentation. So in terms of logistics, before we get started, is I highly recommend that you hide the presenter's face box so that you can see the screen and see all the images in their full detail, because there's a lot of content in these images. And with that, let's get started. So those who study late antiquity will be familiar with Simeon the Stylite. But for those who have not heard about Simeon, Simeon was an ascetic who lived in northern Syria in the 5th century. Simeon was famous for serving as a highly effective intercessor between humans and God. His shrine was a center of healing, and he played a political role in his community. He negotiated conflicts, made economic rulings, and managed land and water rights. And he allegedly did all of this from a series of columns that measured as high as 40 cubits. That is approximately 55 to 60 feet in the air. On the PowerPoint, I have shown a reconstruction of Simeon's final column, a 5th or 6th century representation of the column, and the column as it stood in 2008. The column and Simeon's cult site has sustained substantial damage during the Syrian civil war. And if you want, we can discuss that during the question and answer session. But today, I want to tackle the question of why the column. So to start with that, I want to look at scholarship that's come out in the past 30 years that addresses this topic. And I just want to cover a couple highlights very quickly. So to start, in 1990, David Frankfurter argued that the column was testimony to the continuity of local religious life. Evidence for the vibrancy of columns included 2nd century pillar standers at the cult complex of Atargatis, Betel cults, and crescent standards. And in general, in terms of my evaluation of this scholarship, I agree with Frankfurter's emphasis on the importance of local continuity of the continuity of local religious life. But what in this talk, several sections of it really build off Frankfurter's ongoing work on syncretism, and that's really shaped my perspective today. But I also wanted geographically closer evidence for how to interpret the column and geographically closer visual parallels. So to turn from local religious life to imperial iconography, In 1999, Anthony Eastman emphasized the importance of imperial statues upon columns as a parallel for Simeon's column. So on the PowerPoint, I've shown a reconstruction of the column of Constantine in Constantinople, with the statue of Constantine as Apollo on top of it. The emperors Arcadius, Theodosius, Marcian, Leo, Justinian, and Phocas put up similar columns in Constantinople. And these columns would have been found in imperial cities and major cities throughout the empire, including Antioch. So in my evaluation, yes, there is a visual resemblance between Simeon's column and these imperial statues on columns. But Simeon was probably a semi-pastoralist and spent his life in rural regions. We don't have any evidence that he ever went to a major city in the empire or that he visited Antioch. We may have, but we just don't have evidence for that. So while this imagery was probably a contributing factor to the success of the column, it doesn't necessarily explain Simeon's mind or Simeon's choice to stand upon a column. And in 1988, Susan Harvey argued that, based on the surviving evidence, we simply cannot know Simeon's mind. Instead, we must turn to the discursive processes by which Simeon's three different hagiographies produce the significance of the column. So this is a foundational article for current approaches to hagiography in the literary turn. And it fruitfully shows the meaning, how the meaning of the column changed over time. And so for a long time, when people would ask me, like, what do you think the column means? I would kind of punt it and I would follow, Professor Harvey's lead and say, well, we really don't have a whole lot of evidence written by Simeon himself. It's really hard because we have nothing written or very little written by his hand. It's very hard to interpret what he was thinking. But ultimately, I still get asked that question a lot. And that answer kind of like dodges the actual question. So I really want to try to answer this question today. And so I want to contribute to this debate by focusing on Stylite columns within specific topographical contexts. And I'm going to use the term topographical broadly in this presentation. So I want to refer to both the arrangement of natural features and artificial features of an area at a particular time. So I want to look at the column both within its built environment and within its broader landscape. And to do that, I'm going to focus today on three topographical contexts and make three interconnected arguments for why the column. So first, by selecting the hill adjacent to Telenissos as the location for his columns, Simeon participated in a long-standing regional tradition of activating the numinous power of high places through cultic activity. Second, the monumental pilgrimage complex built after Simeon's death integrated the veneration of Simeon into liturgical ritual. And third, the incorporation of Stylites into northern Syria's Cenobitic communities circumscribed Stylitism as a distinctly monastic vocation. Thus, today, I want to clarify Simeon's choice to don a column, but also show that the significance of his column was not just located in Simeon's genius, but in processes of production and reception. And I hope that you will leave this presentation today both with a more nuanced explanation for why the column, and also an appreciation for how the column's meaning has changed over time. So, my first context, the hilltop adjacent to Telenissos. In this first section, I'm going to do two things. First, I will introduce what the cult site looked like during Simeon's life when he was alive. And second, I will introduce the landscape that Simeon inhabited. And ultimately, I want to argue that Simeon participated and a long-standing visual tradition of establishing sanctuaries on mountaintops. So to start, the cult site. On the plan on your right, you can see the cruciform church and a monastery that was adjoined to it. These structures were built in the late 5th and early 6th century. So these structures were built decades after Simeon died and don't date to his life. The structures that do date to his life on this plan are highlighted in red and orange, and I'm going to talk about these structures right now. So archaeologists have confirmed the existence of 2 different columns. The base of the penultimate column, so Simeon's like second to last column, is now located in the court between the church's south and east arm, and it's kind of like the small bright red square. And then the final column is now located at the center of the cruciform church, and it is the goldish orangish small square. In addition, archaeologists have determined that parts of the monastic complex date to Simeon's life. So this is the L-shaped red and orange, section on your map, with the brightest red parts being the earliest parts. But I also want to kind of nuance this terminology just a little bit, because there's no textual evidence to corroborate that a Cenobitic monastic community lived beneath Simeon's column during his life. I'm not going to call these red structures, these red sections on the plan for Simeon's life. I'm not going to call them a monastery. I'm going to call them the pre-monastic structure. And I hypothesize, it's hard to know what this structure served for, but I hypothesize that this structure served as necessary infrastructure at the site, for example, by serving as a place of prayer, housing Simeon's non-monastic disciples or special pilgrims, or perhaps housing Simeon himself for periods of time. Thus, the architectural configuration of the site during Simeon's life was quite simple. The penultimate and later the ultimate column towered above the site's few structures and the farmland below. Yet, as archaeologists emphasize, the significance of a monument is found not solely in its chosen form. It also emerged through a struggle to assert and interpret that monument's place within the landscape. To understand the significance of Simeon's columns, we must look beyond the site's immediate architectural configuration to the topography of northern Syria's limestone massif, and more specifically, its religious architecture. So let me introduce the physical topography of the limestone massif. The limestone massif is located in the northwestern corner of Syria, and it's characterized by plains divided by broad stretches of limestone hills called in Arabic jebels. So to help orient you to this map, I've marked in purple Simeon's Hill adjacent to Tel Anissos, now called Kalat Saman. And these limestone hills on the map are indicated in gray. These hills were relatively low in elevation. The limestone massif averages between about 500 meters above sea level, and it rarely reaches more than 800 meters above sea level. But the kind of jagged inclines of these hills, in combination with their rocky appearance, dramatically defined the region's landscape. And in this photo, I picked this photo because I think you can see how these low rocky hills frame the fertile fields below. The region also had a distinctive religious topography. From at least the 1st century CE, inhabitants embellished these hilltops with temples dedicated to divinities associated with mountains and sacrifices. So the map on the right of your slide shows the various Roman temples in the limestone massif. I'm in this talk going to be kind of touching upon throughout the presentation 4 different temples that are located fairly close to where Simeon's shrine was located. So these 4 temples are listed on one side of the PowerPoint, right? On the other side, they are like the purple dots on this map. And then the yellow dot is where Simeon's shrine would later be located. So these 4 temples, the most prominent among these was Coryphae. Coryphae was built on an ancient volcano that was 876 meters in elevation. It was the most important Roman temple in this entire region. There was a temple dedicated to Zeus Turabakos at Sarir, and this stood at an elevation of 560 meters. There was a temple dedicated to Zeus Bomos at Berg Bakira, and it stood at an elevation of 558 meters. And finally, temples crown the summit of Kalat Kaluta with an elevation of 560 meters. And these sanctuaries presented an impressive pantheon that presided over the landscape. Located on high points, these temples overlooked the region's rich agricultural lands. So this map here zooms in to the map that I showed you earlier and has 3 temples on it. Coryphae, which is labeled here as Sheikh Barakat, the Temple of Zeus Turbarakos at Sarir, and the Temple of Zeus Bomos at Berg Bakira. And located, Kalat Saman is located to the north, kind of above this map. And then located between these 3 temples that are on high points is this, in the triangle, is this plain of Dina. And I like this map because I think it very clearly shows how these are positioned in the topography to overlook this plain. And that looking from the plain below, people would have been able to see displays of rituals from the valleys. And this point is really critical for my argument that these temples were highly visible. Temples could be seen from the valleys below. In particular, the summit of Coryphae could be seen from all directions. Furthermore, these temples were in visual relationship with each other. So the temples of Zeus Turbarakos at Sarir and Zeus Bomos stood in direct line with Coryphae. And I like this photo of the temple of Zeus Bomos because it shows how the temple acted almost like a pointer to the ancient volcano on which the temple at Coryphae stood. Thus, the position of these temples on high points established a visual vocabulary that people would know for centuries. So this was the situation in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, but what about the state of these temples in the 4th and early 5th century, right? Simeon arrived in this area and then set up his column on a hill in this area in the beginning of the 5th century. So by Simeon's time, formal worship of the traditional gods had waned, and we can see this in the limestone Massif's temples. At the end of the 4th century, the temple at Coryphae had been dismantled, but we don't know why. It could have been violent, it could have been atropaic, or it simply could have been a search for building materials. The demise of Sarir and Berg Bakira is similarly murky, but presumably formal institutional support ceased sometime in the 4th century. And in the 5th century, the ruins of Kalat Kaluta's temples were converted into a church. But what happened at Kalat Kaluta, again, during the 4th century and the beginning of the 5th century before it is converted, it's unclear. And it seems like these sites were kind of slowly abandoned. So it's my hypothesis that these temples played an ambiguous role in the landscape in the 4th and 5th centuries. Formal worship had ceased, but their liminality endured. And I think that hauntings is a really useful way to think about the presence of these temples or decaying temples in the landscape. Their abandonment displayed an eeriness produced by loss. And we can imagine that these were highly emotional places within the landscape. Some people opposed or feared them. Others would have interpreted them with a high degree of anxiety. They were sites of unofficial and unofficiated power. And for others, they presented a deep loss. And we must remember that informal activity did probably continue at these sites. At Corifei in the 5th or 6th century, individuals built a small chapel into the ruins of the sanctuary. And it was simple and it was minimally used, which suggests that rather than read it as some sort of like, Christian supremacy, we should actually interpret it, I think, as highlighting the continuity of Corifei as a hallowed locale for some of the region's inhabitants. Thus, when Simeon chose his location for his column, I think he knew quite well that the landscape around him teemed with meanings seen and unseen. And remember that Simeon was probably at least a semi-pastoralist during his life. So he had a lot of specialized environmental knowledge. He would have known how to navigate a landscape, and he would have, been able to perceive these tensions within the landscape. At an elevation of 564 meters, Simeon's chosen hill overlooked the village of Telenissos and the bountiful plain of Chatura. But more importantly, his ever-increasing columns were in direct view of Corifei. So this photo shows you the view from Simeon's column towards Corifei. And this photo shows you the view from Corifei towards Simeon's columns. So I think Simeon knew what he was doing here when he chose this location. But the question for us is, what statement was Simeon trying to make? And I'm going to give you two different answers for that, and I'm going to walk you through these answers. So potential answer one is competition. Faced with the continuity of devotional practices by local populations, Simeon may well have selected the site for his column in order to confront and redirect such activities. Simeon's chosen location opposed the dilapidated sanctuaries of the gods of old, and the columns provided a new vector through which one could access divine aid. But what's odd about this hypothesis is that Simeon's hagiographers don't describe Simeon as purifying a pagan site. And this is weird because the hagiography is a genre that engages strongly in rhetoric of conflict with pagans, right? This was rhetoric and language that Theodoret, who wrote during Simeon's life, knew how to use. So the fact that he doesn't describe Simeon's activities and Simeon's column standing within with this kind of language, with this rhetoric, I think should give us pause in terms of us potentially interpreting Simeon's column standing in this way, right? The ambiguity in the hagiographical record should warn us that we need to be more nuanced in interpreting Simeon's choice of location and column standing as well. So answer two, sustained engagement. And this, I think, is a better, more nuanced answer. Whether or not Simeon's choice to erect his columns upon this particular hill was oppositionally oriented, it contained within it the presupposition that one could most effectively activate sacred powers in high places. Simeon's columns accrued meaning because of their location in a landscape populated with temples celebrating high points. And they used the same spatial vocabulary as earlier temples and appropriated this vocabulary in service of Christian ascetic performance. Thus, topography prompted Simeon's actions, and Simeon, in turn, added a new layer to the cumulative landscape. But we also need to keep in mind one important difference between Simeon and these earlier temples. The focus of Simeon's shrine during his life was ultimately not the column, but the holy man, right? It was not the architectural feature that people came to see. They came to see the person, the living person. I'm going to come back to this point, but for now, it suffices to say that I think we can think of the column as a technology that linked hilltop, right? Stone outcrop that would have been carved, column, human, and sky, right? And by the column lifting Simeon up, Simeon was able to dwell amongst the angels and communicate more effectively and be a more effective intercessor with God, right? That's what I think the logic of the column is. And you hear this language of Simeon living amongst the angels in various written texts. And it's interesting that that kind of reappears so often. Okay, so we'll come back to this point. Let's turn now to the monumental pilgrimage complex. This is context 2 of the 3 contexts I want to cover today. So Simeon dies in 459. Within the decades following Simeon's death, builders constructed a massive complex that included a cruciform church, a monastery, hostels, a baptistry, a baptismal church, a main gate, walls, and additional structures. And just to emphasize how, large and stunning this complex is, the square footage of the cruciform church actually is comparable to Hagia Sophia, to Justinian's Hagia Sophia in Constantinople. So this is one of the largest churches in the entire Eastern Empire. And this is the form of the site that many of you have probably seen in pictures. And I've put here a picture of the southern facade of the cruciform church. This would have been the main entrance to the church. So in this section of the talk, I'm going to focus mainly on the cruciform church, although there were many buildings at this site. And I'm going to focus on the church because I think the church does a lot of work to redefine the final column, and because it's probably the earliest or one of the earliest structures of this monumental building program. So it really is a core, if not the core component. And on this slide, you can see the structures that existed during Simeon's life, again in red, and then the first phase of the monumental building program in gold. So the darker gold is what was built first, and then the lighter greenish gold around it was built after, but very soon after, like within years. Okay, the plan of the church. So the cruciform church is comprised of 4 different basilicas. The South Basilica, which I showed you a picture of the entrance to on the previous slide, served as the main entrance to the church. The East Basilica served as the location for celebration of Eucharistic liturgy. The North and West Basilicas allowed devotees to view the column from various angles, and to venerate additional relics and other objects and burials that were associated with Simeon's cult in different parts of this church. And then the 4 arms converge upon an octagon. And in the center of that octagon was Simeon's final column, which is pictured here for you. So by enclosing the church within the octagon, I want to suggest, or I want to argue in this subsection of the talk, that planners and builders did 3 things, or at least the construction of this basilica and the enclosure of the column does 3 things. I'm going to go through each of those 3 things. The first thing it does is transform the column into a relic. Scholars have shown that encasement, in other words, the reliquary, was central to making a relic. We can think of the octagon as a massive reliquary for the column. In addition, it's important to remember that the octagon was roofed, at least when it was initially built. The roof later falls in, but initially it's roofed. And here you can see, I've put before you a reconstruction by the French archaeological team. And note that at least within their reconstruction of the roof did not have an oculus, meaning that the column was totally enclosed. So let's compare this column with the previous setup that we saw during Simeon's life, right? During Simeon's life, we have these series of open air columns topped by a human. And the column functioned to link mountain, human, sky, God. It enhanced Simeon's intercession. So now we have a column completely enclosed within a church, no longer stood upon by a human, and the column's relationship with the sky is completely broken. So this, I think, is a really big change in the technology of the column and thinking about how the column works. Now the column is a signifier for Simeon's body and a full agent of intercession. And I think it's the architecture that does this, right? This is the moment when the column becomes a relic. So second, and now remember, I wanted to cover 3 different things that this church does in terms of how it transforms the column. Second, the enclosure of the column inside the church changes the column's presence in the landscape. So to return to our photo of the view of Kolatsaman from Corfe, the column no longer faced the summit of the ancient volcano, right, of Corfe. Now the southern facade of the cruciform church faced Corfe. So whereas I think the column was a more ambiguous statement in this kind of, anxious, haunted landscape, I think the church is a much more clear statement of ecclesiastical power in this landscape. And third, this is going back to my 3 things. The enclosure of the column inside the church subordinates the column to Eucharistic liturgy. This is a thesis that's already been asserted by John Paul Sodini, or J.P. Sodini, and Anne-Marie Yasin, and so I'm going to review it here. Sodini and Yasin have argued that the cruciform plan of the church centered attention on the column, but it is also necessary to examine how spaces would have unfolded before the viewer as they moved through the complex, right? So in other words, what we have in front of us is a bird's eye view, and we've kind of talked about how the octagon is kind of at the center of this plan, of this bird's eye view, but users who moved through this space didn't have this bird's eye view. So on the plan on the right, I've indicated with purple arrows the path of the visitor. The visitor would depart Telenesos. They would have traveled up the sacred way. Then they would have passed through the main gate. So here we're on our plan. They would then go through the first esplanade, through a second passageway, through a second esplanade, and then enter the southern arm of the church. And at this point, they would reach the column. So I've added a purple arrow to the aerial photo so that you can orient yourself on that photo as well. So what we are looking at here is that the visitor essentially follows a north-south path from Telenesos to the column. But the column is not the endpoint of the spatial organization of the church. In the church's organization, the visitor would walk around the column and enter the eastern arm of the church. Here we can see that at the column, the visitor's path of movement changes from a north-south axis to an east-west axis. The column marked the physical turning point of the visitor's journey and demarcated the entrance to the liturgical wing of the church. And I like this photo because it's taken of the column looking towards the eastern apse of the church. And I think it really clearly shows that the column marks the entrance to this wing. With this arrangement, the cruciform plan shifted the visitor's attention between 2 centers of power, column and altar. The relationship between column and altar imbued both spatial centers with meaning, Veneration of the column became preparatory for Eucharistic liturgy. But ultimately, the altar, not the column, was the culmination of the church's spatial hierarchy. So to conclude this part of the presentation, I've argued here that the pilgrimage complex does three things. It made the column a relic. It situated the church to directly oppose the ruins of the Roman temple at Coryphae. And it made the column an object that enhanced Eucharistic celebration. And in these ways, the cruciform church fundamentally changes the technology of the column, the way the column worked, and its role within the landscape. Okay, now for topographical context number 3, the monastery. So we just looked at the cruciform church and Simeon's final column. But remember, multiple columns survive at Simeon's site. What about the penultimate column? Well, following the construction of the church, builders adjoined to the church a full Cenobitic monastery. So now we're back on our chronological plan. Remember, earliest phases are in red, the church is in gold, and the monastery, which dates to the 6th century, is in green, and it comes to incorporate, right, these red structures. So the builders take the pre-monastic structures in red that I mentioned earlier and incorporate them into a full monastic complex that includes dormitories, a refectory, storage spaces, and a monastic church, among other, other areas. And pressed against the south and east arms of the church, the monastery forms this closed off complex at the heart of what was a bustling pilgrimage complex. And located within the monastery's courtyard was the penultimate column. This location integrated the column with the community's daily routines. Monks passed it as they crossed between the monastery's buildings, entered the church, or exited the complex. The location also positioned it as an object under the control of the monastic community. Only those able to enter the complex could have close contact with the penultimate column. So if you think about this, like, it was possible to see the penultimate column through certain windows in the church. And we actually know that there's a little chapel that's built to view this column. But the view of the penultimate column is highly controlled. It's a very focused view, which is very different from the expansive views of the final column as you move through the church, right? Where you can view the column from far away, view it up close, view it from all these different angles. So you have a very open, expansive view in the church compared with this very controlled view of the column that is in the monastic complex. So thus, whereas the cruciform church made the final column a relic and liturgical object, the monastery made the penultimate column a distinctly monastic object. And here, I want to note a bigger change that's taking place within the history of Simeon's cult. And this kind of enclosure of the penultimate column is a part of that change. So based on all the written evidence, Simeon did not have strong relationships with Cenobitic monastic communities during his life. He gets kicked out of a monastery for not following the community's rules. We have 3 hagiographies of Simeon, one written during his life, one written 13 years after his death, one written far later. But all 3 of these, and all 3 of these hagiographies, not a single one mentions a monk visiting Simeon on his column. They do mention priests, soldiers, political officials, diplomatic missions, village chiefs, pastoralists. So the systematic omission of monks in all 3 texts, I think, should be taken seriously. Hagiographical sources, in specific the Syriac life of Simeon, does not use the term monk to describe Simeon's disciples. It uses the term disciple or attendant. It does use a separate term for monk to talk about organized communities elsewhere, but does not use that for Simeon's own disciples. And Evagrius Scholasticus mentions a letter to Simeon sent from Egyptian monks condemning his column and demanding that he get down from the column. So in my evaluation, during Simeon's life, Simeon's public, rigorous, individualistic ascetic performance presented a serious challenge to the spiritual authority of at least certain organized monastic communities. So here, 40 to 50 years after Simeon's death, to see an organized monastic community appropriating the penultimate column, incorporating it into the complex, this is really redefining the meaning of stylitism. And it doesn't just happen at this complex. It happens at monasteries throughout the Near East. So Simeon was the first, but not the only stylite to don a column. Literary and archaeological evidence testifies to the existence of over 87 stylites, most of them based in the Levant. These include 28 in Syria, 19 that we know of in the Limestone Massif, 18 in Mesopotamia, and numerous columns scattered throughout eastern provinces. Some of these columns are famous, right? Some of you will have heard of Simeon the Younger's monastery upon the Wondrous Mountain outside of Antioch, and Daniel the Stylite's complex outside of Constantinople. But most of these columns were located in simple monasteries, simple small monasteries. So on this slide, I've shown one of these Stylite monasteries located in Mesopotamia. This is the monastery of Mor-Lazor near Nisibis. And for the remainder of this presentation, I want to look at 3 case studies of Stylite monasteries from the 6th century limestone Massif in order to illustrate both the changing vocation of stylitism and the changing meaning of the column, and the changing importance of stylites within the landscape of northern Syria, because they come to have a very significant presence in that landscape. So my first example is Qasr el-Barad. And I think that this is a really good example to start with because it shows a nice transition from the very public and individualistic ministry of Simeon to, a step towards contextualizing a column within a monastery. So Qasr el-Barad, like most Stylite monasteries, was small. Its structures covered the basics of monastic life, with living quarters, a tomb, a chapel, and a tower. So the Stylites column is located 30 meters southwest of the chapel. The chapel is located as Église on this plan. And at least according to the preliminary archaeological surveys that have been done of this convent, it does not look like a wall completely surrounded the column. So this location, kind of at the corner of the monastery, not completely walled into the monastery, I think ensured a close association with the monastery, but also potentially allowed for an ascetic regimen not necessarily bound by the communal schedule. Similarly, the column's height of 8 meters, a height on the short side when compared with Simeon's 17 to 19 meter column, and its location at the edge of the monastery, not bounded by a wall, facilitated communication with monastic, but also non-monastic supplicants. Thus, the spatial relationship between the column and the monastery, I think, allowed for the Stylites' individualistic ascetic vision, sustained the Stylites' public role, and placed the column under the oversight of the Cenobitic community. So this is a good, I think, kind of transitional monastery. The monastery at Kefir-Dirion demonstrates an even closer association between Stylitism and Cenobitic life than Qasr el-Barad. The monastery at Kefir-Dirion was comprised of a circuit wall, an entry pavilion, and a main building that included a church, a crypt, and living accommodations. The Stylite's column was located inside the monastery's walls, which suggests that the non-monastic access to the Stylite was highly controlled. And in addition, at this monastery, we actually know the name and the role within the monastery of one of the Stylite's occupants, potentially the first occupant, but we're not sure. So in 567, the column's occupant co-signed a formula of confession reached during a meeting at the monastery of Marbasis, and he identified himself as Jonas, the archimandrite who stood on a column in the village of Kepherdirion. Thus, not only was the Stylite tightly integrated into Cenobitic life, but he also functioned as the monastery's administrative leader and representative in theological controversies. So both of these examples, right, Barad and Kepherdirion, show a change in the vocation of Stylitism. Stylitism was not the highly individualized ascetic practice of an independent holy man, but a path for monastic training. So our final third case study of a Stylite monastery brings us back to the Limestone Massif's haunted landscapes. As noted above, the temple of Zeus Turbarakos at Sarir went out of use in the 4th or early 5th century and seems to have had a period of abandonment. Sometime, or semi-abandonment, right? Not formal use. Sometime in the late 5th or 6th century, monks installed a column in Sarir's sanctuary and remodeled Zeus Turbarakos' temple to comprise one of several monastic structures at the site. The new monastic structures included a gatehouse, a tower, dormitories, a church with a crypt, and surrounding walls. So like at Kepherdirion, the monastery at Sarir integrated the vocation of Stylitism with the daily life of Cenobitic monks. Located between the dormitories and the church, a monk couldn't walk from his living quarters to the chapel without passing the column. But at the same time, the repurposing of the temple's remains, the sizable Cenobitic structures, and the height of the column at 12 meters silenced the whispers of the gods of old upon Sarir and pronounced Sarir's crest to be a monastic abode. And importantly, the Stylite at Sarir was not the only Stylite to occupy the grounds of derelict temples and summits of the Limestone Massif. So on this map, this is the same map, like base map that I showed you earlier, but instead of my purple dots marking Roman temples, I've now used these purple dots to mark 6th century Stylites, right? So as you can see, some of these Stylites are located on hilltops. Some are located adjacent to, or, you know, within the sanctuary of a Roman temple, right? So monks constructed a Stylite monastery north of the sanctuary at Coryphae. They construct a Stylite monastery in Sarir. They construct Stylite monasteries and set up Stylite columns at other high points. And as you can see, they set up Stylite columns along roads, right? So many of these columns are also located along road systems. Thus, whereas the eerie debris of the temples upon Sarir and Coryphae conjured the specter of a lost past and a wavering present, the establishment of columns and Cenobitic structures at the sites of the gods of old and around the sites of the gods of old added a formidable topographic layer to the Limestone Massif's palimpsestic landscape. In total, 19 Stylites have been identified in the Limestone Massif. Collectively, these 19 columns formed a web of sightlines that displayed the dominion of pillar saints. So in a recent article, Lucas Schachner used viewshed analysis to ascertain, I love this study so much, to ascertain how far you could see from the top of the different columns and how far columns could be seen from, right? So this map shows the various stylite columns in the limestone massif, with gray areas estimating areas of visibility and black dotted lines indicating lines of sight between columns. And Schachner concluded, quote, this is like my favorite quote from one of my favorite quotes from secondary scholarship of like all the research that I do, because it's just so powerful. A traveler on the Roman road from Antioch to Dina in Chalcis Boero would have found himself, whether willing or not, within the visual range of a holy man for over 10 kilometers or 2 to 3 hours of travel, and never more than 2.4 kilometers distance from the next pillar ascetic. If the same traveler decided to turn north to Dana, to Cyrus, this proximity would have continued for circa 20 kilometers or 5 to 6 hours of travel, end quote. Thus, for the individual stylite, the column functioned as an apparatus for regulating the stylite's prayer, but when repeatedly positioned upon high points, columns served as technologies of surveillance over the region's peoples and haunts. Furthermore, the topographical situation of columns cannot be disaggregated from the institution of monasticism by the 6th century. The limestone massif's visual network of columns brandished the ideological, economic, and religious dominance of monastic institutions in rural Syria. Together, columns and monasteries rising from peaks, often nested within or between the ruins of temples and located along roads, asserted symbolic control of the monumental in the region's animated topography. They presented a new vision of the landscape, one punctuated by the residences of ambiguous spirits to one celebrating monastic authority. So in conclusion, I have shown today that stylite columns were both products of their topography and agents within it. When Simeon first donned an ascetic life upon a column, he joined a chorus of sites on the revered summits of northern Syria. The column invigorated longstanding habits of devotion and repurposed those habits for Christian practice. Half a century later, the construction of the pilgrimage complex at Kalat Zaman fundamentally altered the meaning of the column. It positioned a massive church as opposing the temples of the gods of old and made the column an integral component of liturgical celebration. With the incorporation of stylitism into monasteries throughout the limestone massif, stylitism transformed into a monastic vocation. Furthermore, topographical and architectural context of columns clarify their workings as a technology. Columns consistently facilitated prayer, but their application changed as the column was translated into new spatial arrangements and operated by humans beyond Simeon. At first, the column marshaled the power of high places to form a channel of communication between heaven and earth. The construction of the cruciform church broke the column's connection with the heavens and moved the location of intercession from human to object. It made the column a relic. Finally, in Cenobitic monasteries, new humans donned columns, but this time the column functioned as a tool for regulating the bodies of monks. The archaeological remains examined in this presentation are only one step in examining the various topographical contexts that shaped the meaning of stylite columns, and vice versa, the work that columns did within their topographies. Each assemblage drew from contemporary concentrations of holiness and appropriated it within new institutional contexts. Each recast charisma from uncontrollable to controlled. And each participated in a conversation that continually redefined the vocation of stylitism for viewers and practitioners. And within each, the columns talked back. They faced the gods of old, They enriched ecclesiastical rituals. They proclaimed the ascendancy of monastic institutions. Their accumulation constructed a distinctive Christian landscape. Thank you. All right, that's it.
So I know there you can't really hear any of the participants, but I promise you everybody's applauding at home. And I'll applaud here for you. That was really an incredible presentation. We only have a few more minutes left, but I did want to take advantage of those minutes and ask a quick question that kind of came up during your presentation. Something that I was really interested in learning a little bit more about is, could you talk a bit more about the minting of Stylite tokens and perhaps where that process may have taken place?
Wait, say it again. I couldn't quite hear you.
Sorry. Could you speak a little bit more about the process of minting Stylite tokens and where that might have taken place? Maybe evidence from the archaeological record?
Yeah. So this is a really great example. The French excavation team recently excavated the shop at Kalatzaman, where the tokens would have been, we think they would have been sold, but maybe they were gifted, right? And so that was kind of it's located kind of like right before where there's this monumental arch, and it's located in conjunction with this monumental arch before you enter. It's debated whether that location is actually the site of production. They didn't really find any molds at that location. They did find fires, but those fire pits could have been, for example, used for making bread. We do have a couple surviving examples of molds for different pilgrimage tokens. And the mechanism for making tokens was quite simple, right? You carved a mold, you got a piece of clay, you put the piece of clay in your palm, and then you just stamped it, right? And if you flip over the tokens, you can see the palm lines of the people who were holding this clay. So the production was simple. It could have been done in a lot of different contexts. There have been some scientific studies to suggest that at least, a set of the Simeon's tokens were produced around Kalatzaman, the clay lines. But we don't have the exact location of production. At Abu Mina, we have actually, the archaeologists did find the kilns at the turn of the 20th century with a bunch of different terracotta figurines. But it's my understanding, and I could be wrong, that the location of those kilns no longer survive, they haven't made it the past 100 years. So we have those archaeological reports. I'm not sure that is still within the archaeological site right now.
Yeah. And I guess it's just going to extend on this point right quick. How early do these kind of start to begin to show up?
The tokens? Yeah, so some people want to date them back to Simeon's life. In his life, they do talk about Simeon using dust and oil and water, but they never talk about tokens. Because they never concretely talk about tokens, I'm not sure that they were used during Simeon's life. I feel much safer placing their distribution at the beginning of the 6th century, because that's when we get archaeologically attested tokens in contexts that we can archaeologically date. Yeah. Now that said, they could be being used earlier, right? Just because they're in that context. But I think the beginning of the 6th century is a really safe date or the first third of the 6th century is a very safe date for when these tokens start to be distributed. Yeah.
Okay. And we're just at time, but I did get one interesting question that I did want to ask you right quick. Someone reached out and asked, and they were a little bit curious about the columns and asking if they functioned a little like timeshares. So that is, are there part-time stylites in a given year, or individuals that inhabit a column, as opposed to just one person kind of being on this one column?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So there are certain stylites who I think inhabit columns their whole life, and that's a big deal. Like Simeon the Younger, Simeon the Elder, Daniel. I think they really were up there for large portions of their life, right? But at these smaller monasteries, we definitely have, I think, we have literary evidence that says that people would get up on these columns for a period of time. It was a form of training, of monastic training, and then they would get down and do other things, right? So in John of Ephesus, we have this one stylite, Zura, and he stands up there, it says, for a term of years. And then he gets down and he goes to Constantinople and promotes the anti-Chalcedonian cause. And so really this stylitism kind of functioned as a training that for this phase of Zura's career that was actually for John of Ephesus, probably a more powerful, in his estimation, a more powerful phase of his career. We also have examples in John of Ephesus of columns being inhabited by multiple stylites, right? That like one stylite dies and another stylite goes and stands on the column. So I do think that there are certainly cases where there are multiple stylites standing upon columns.
That's great. That I think perfectly answered that question. Well, again, thank you very much for taking the time to be here with us.
Thank you for having me.
An incredible presentation. Thank you everyone for coming out, and hopefully we'll see you around.
All right.